welcome to Ending the Pandemic, the road to an inclusive recovery. I'm Becky Anderson, live from CNN's broadcasting hub here in Abu Dhabi in the UAE, bringing you this special event alongside the 2021 World Bank and International Monetary Fund annual meetings. Today, we've reached a critical moment. We can either take urgent action to end the pandemic and get the global economy back on track, or we must reconcile ourselves with a world where the pandemic will ebb and flow and where our economies will never reach their true potential. And here's the deal. If we want to move beyond this pandemic, we must make sure at least 40% of all people in all countries are vaccinated by the end of this year. That is the message from the leaders I have joining me here today. They have come together, establishing a task force aimed at doing just that. Well, I'm delighted to be joined from Washington by the World Bank President David Malpass, International Monetary Fund Chief Kristalina Georgieva, the World Trade Organization Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and from Geneva, the World Health Organization Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus. Choices we make in the coming years will determine whether developing countries suffer a lost decade or can usher in rapid growth and economic transformation. Those are the words of the World Bank head, David Malpass. Bottom line, we can't recover without global cooperation and coordination. We can't get there without tackling vaccine inequality. According to the Global Dashboard for Vaccine Equity, established in part by the WHO, as of October the 6th, 61% of those living in high-income countries have been jabbed with at least one shot. That figure drops to less than 4% in low-income countries. Less than 4%. Let that sink in. Well, the goal of the Multilateral Leaders Task Force then is to figure out essentially how to close this gap. To suggest that there is an alarming shortage of supply is to frankly understate the extent of the problem. So, David, I'd like to start with you this evening. What is needed to boost vaccine supply and access in developing countries? Let's start there.
Thanks, Becky, and you're right, 40% is the goal, and that's not being achieved. What we need to do, and it's particularly apparent in Africa, is to get doses to people that are ready to deliver them. There is plentiful supply. The production is going up very rapidly in the advanced economies, but there's a gap between the donations and the actual deliveries of those donated doses into, in particular, Africa. What we need to do is get the donators, the countries that have excess vaccines, to state and follow through in an accountable way with the deliveries, the dates of the delivery, the type of the vaccine that's going into the developing countries. World Bank can help in a number of areas. We have financing available. We right now have AVAT, a contract within Africa that's been successful in getting doses to people. We have today 250,000 doses under contract that will be delivered. So we're trying to have early delivery dates for the donations that have been committed by the advanced economies. And we need to know what the type of vaccine is and where it's going to be delivered so we can work on the hesitancy problem.
Right, okay. Tedros, you and I have been talking vaccine inequality for over 12 months. Progress with respect to all of you has been painfully slow. I know you know that. Firstly, are these donations enough, sir?
Yeah, thank you, Becky. The donations are not enough. And to be honest, as you said, very slow. Plus, it's very disappointing that it's taking so long for the world to really commit. Because epidemiologically, it's wrong because we cannot end this pandemic. Economically, it's wrong because the economy globally is not recovering. And also morally is wrong And, there should be a political commitment to address this problem. As you have rightly said, if you take low-income countries, it's only 4%. And if you take it in another way, 70% of the delivery is just to 10 countries. That's completely unfair. And, this will not end the pandemic. And it's in the interest of all countries, rich, poor, or middle income, to end this pandemic. And that's why, together with my colleagues in the task force, we are saying there is a 40% by the end of this year target and 70% by mid next year. We have to, especially G20 countries should own those targets and make it happen, because more than 80% of the economy belongs to them, and the bulk of the production capacity also belongs to them. If there is political commitment and they want to do it, they can do it. So that's what we're asking.
That's the big question, though, isn't it, sir? That's the big question. Is there political commitment? Stand by. I just want to bring our other two guests in tonight. Let's be quite clear about this. Ngozi, let me start with you. Just how realistic are these targets at this point? We are talking at least 40% of people in every country vaccinated by the end of 2021 and at least 60% by mid-2022. We are way away from those levels at this point.
Well, thank you very much, Becky. I think that with these targets, yes, we are well away. You can see the numbers that you talked about, 4% in low-income countries versus over 60% in rich countries. But if you can see the progress that can be made in countries when they have access to these vaccines, and where the ability to distribute them and get them into arms is there. So I think if we decide as a community that we can do this, we will do it. We are very far away from where we need to be, but we need to ramp up now, because as Tedros said, it's just not acceptable that we have this gap. So let's get the vaccines delivered quickly. We have countries waiting to put these vaccines into arms. Let's get them delivered, and we may be able to achieve this target. It's very ambitious given where we are now, but it's not impossible.
Kristalina, stand by, because I do want to get your perspective on this. But the cold, hard fact, according to Amnesty International, out of the nearly 6 billion COVID-19 doses delivered worldwide, a paltry 0.3% have gone to low-income countries. And at this point, I just want to draw on some CNN reporting to underscore the challenge here. Let's look at Africa, for example. Stand by.
I'm David McKenzie in Johannesburg. If you look around me, life seems to be getting back to normal. But this country, this region has suffered through a devastating COVID-19 pandemic. The big issue now, to avoid future waves, is of course vaccines. Vaccine nationalism and vaccine hoarding has really hurt the efforts for an equitable access across the world, particularly in Africa, for COVID-19 vaccines. The African continent, there are far less than 10% of people who've received their full complement of COVID-19 vaccines, even as rich countries are giving booster shots to their most vulnerable. Now the issue is, as manufacturers ramp up vaccination production, can the money and the resources be made available to get vaccines out to nations on the African continent, or can there be a deal made on dropping intellectual property of those vaccines? All I can say is, through all my reporting on this issue, is the talk of solidarity has largely been talk. Now it's time for action.
Kristalina, get the money and resources to where they matter most is David's appeal. What is being done to address finance and trade barriers to ensure that vulnerable populations get these life-saving tools?
Thank you very much for bringing us together, Becky. What we have seen is much more awareness of the economic significance of overcoming this great vaccination divide. And that awareness is slowly translating in more willingness to act. So what do we know? We know that the world economy is recovering, but risks are going up, and the divergence in economic fortunes is expanding. Why that matters to advanced economies, to rich countries? Because if part of the world continues to be slow to recover, held back by lack of access to vaccines, by limited fiscal space, that not only causes supply disruptions, and these supply disruptions are one of the factors pushing prices up, but it also creates space for new variants of COVID to flourish and run around the world. We have done very careful analysis that says for $50 billion, we can achieve the target of vaccinating 40% by the end of this year, 70% actually. Tedros lifted it up to 70% target by mid-2022. Of this 50 billion, we now see more than close to 2/3 being made available. But we still have a gap to fill. What are we doing? I want to praise the World Bank for stepping up. They are now willing and able to secure 20 billion in financing. We at the IMF provided the largest in our history allocation of the so-called special drawing rights, the reserve asset of the IMF that gives countries fiscal space. Where are the bottlenecks? I do strongly believe that there are two. One, it is timely allocation of vaccines to developing countries. If a rich country doesn't need the vaccines in November, can receive them in February, move the delivery in November to the developing world. And secondly, and this is where it is so important we work together, getting a vial, a vaccine to turn into a shot in the arm. And in many poor countries, it is this getting the vaccine from the tarmac where it is stored to the child or the woman or the man in a village up in the mountains. That is the toughest part of this delivery. I want to answer your question honestly. Can we get to 40% everywhere? This is going to be tough. But can we get much closer to 40% everywhere and at or more than 40% in many countries? Yes, the vaccines are produced. We have to make sure they get where they would make a difference.
Would a decision by the developed world to advise booster shots to its populations prevent you as a task force from achieving your goal? David?
I don't think that's the key issue. The production is going up so rapidly, there may be enough to do boosters and to reach targets in 2022. The key thing that I would emphasize is for finance ministers in countries and their health ministers to seek contracts, to try to get delivery dates that are early and to ask for them and to request them. And then for the advanced economies to go along with that, to help get the early delivery dates. I was in Sudan. Well, let me mention two things. J&J doses are particularly valuable in Africa. Europe has committed to shipping doses to J&J doses to Africa. Complete that so that the people can have those doses. I was in Khartoum and in Amman last week, and they're vaccinating people day by day. The hesitancy is going down as once people have vaccines, and if they have the syringes and the needles that can be brought in with the shipments of the doses, then the people are being vaccinated. So that part of the system is working, but we need more clear delivery dates from the various sources. World Bank has 61 countries that have programs with us, and we can expand that to 100 countries if the countries ask for doses and arrange for getting the contracts set up in an accountable way. That's key.
Tedros, I have to get you to give us your perspective at this point on boosters.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. On boosters, I will again go back to the figures because the world should understand the inequity, the injustice. As I said earlier, 6.5 billion doses have already been administered. And of this, Africa got only 166 million. 166 million for 1.2 billion people. And the rest, 6.3 billion, is for the rest of the world. Then I can show you in a different way. For instance, if you take South America, North America, Europe, Asia, Oceania, as a region, all of them are above 50%, at least single dose, while Africa is only 7% single dose, or 4.8%. So as a region, the focus should be that. Then bringing it back to boosters, when there is only 166 million delivered in Africa for 1.2 billion, to start booster is really the worst we could do as global community. It's unjust and also unfair, because we will not stop this pandemic by ignoring the whole continent, and the continent which doesn't have any manufacturing capacity or other means. So the world should come back to its senses. I don't want to spread it by saying all low-income countries. The concentration of the problem is in one continent. Let's take that first. So on boosters, for countries to move into boosters without even providing single doses in Africa is not right. So it has to be stopped, and countries should respect the moratorium. Of course, there are exceptions. You know, we can use it in immunocompromised populations, immunocompromised. The rest, it's immoral, unfair, unjust, and it has to stop.
Ngozi and Kristalina, I must get your perspective on this. Ngozi, briefly.
Well, briefly, I think one of the ways to solve this inequity of access, which I agree totally with Tedros, is unacceptable, is to decentralize production. If we are going to continue needing boosters and things like that, it's evident that we need to decentralize production to some of the countries that have no capacity. And on the African continent, 17% of the world population, 0.2% of the manufacturing capacity. We cannot continue importing 99% of our vaccines. So at the WTO, we've actually been working with manufacturers of these vaccines to try and help them with their supply chain problems, monitoring where there are bottlenecks so that they can be able to increase production. And at the same time, working with them to encourage them to set up manufacturing in emerging markets and developing countries. And I think, Becky, that is yielding some fruit. We've now heard an announcement by Pfizer of investment in South Africa and Aspen. And we've heard of Moderna is just saying that it's going to set up some production facilities on the continent. But we need to get the capacity to produce.
The three leading vaccine manufacturers, BioNTech, Moderna, and Pfizer, could net $130 billion by the end of this year. Ngozi, you're right. We have seen some progress in manufacturing plants being set up. But are these manufacturers prolonging this pandemic by putting profits before people?
You know, we hear a lot about the profits before people. And obviously, if you look at their numbers, it is true that, you know, they're earning far more than they ever have. That's why we're working with them to say, look, the perception of this profits before the lives of people is neither good publicly for you, nor for everyone, not for anyone. So we're working with them to really try to get partnerships on the continent, in Latin America as well, in low-income countries, so that they can demonstrate that, look, for them, it's not profits, but it's people. It's coming along. I think we need the manufacturers, because without them, we're not going to be able to manufacture vaccines. Vaccines are complicated. You need the technology transfer, the know-how, to be able to do it, along with the issues of intellectual property. So we cannot alienate them, but we have to persuade them that it's better for them to be public citizens and put people before profit.
Kristalina, I promised to come back to you. I want to get your perspective on the idea that the developing world will go ahead and provide booster shots when the developing world is in such dire need. It has, though, been a year since South Africa and India first called for the suspension of intellectual property protection on vaccines and related technologies. And this is something Ngozi has just been alluding to. The UK, Norway, Switzerland and the EU are still blocking the waiver needed to make that happen. Do you and do your fellow leaders here today call on countries to back this proposal, at least until the fight against the pandemic is over?
At the IMF, we actually researched the question of production versus availability. And the answer is production capacity can deliver doses for countries that still don't have it, and it can deliver boosters. The problem is to prioritize delivery for those who do not yet have access to vaccines. And for that purpose, what we are pressing for, actually all four of us, is disclosure of contracts, transparency of who bought what for what delivery date, and is this a good match of the objective we presented, vaccinate at least 40% of the world population by the end of this year. And I can tell you that in our view, that transparency of contracts and delivery schedules is going to go a long way to optimize the production capacity. I want to make two more points on the question of do we want to see more self-reliance? The answer is yes. We are very keen that this crisis turns into an opportunity for Africa to be more self-reliant. And in fact, I was very pleased to learn from Senegal that they're going to use a portion of the special drawing rights we have allocated to Senegal exactly for this purpose. Our assessment is that if African countries take 1 billion of the special drawing rights to move it towards expanding production, it can do a lot of good for the future. And my second point is to be clear that yes, we do need more collaboration on all fronts. Ngozi is the expert on the trade issues, so I don't want to jump into her field. But the simple final point I want to make here, Becky, is that we are so much in this together, we can get out of it only together.
David, the World... Yeah, no, you make a very good point. David, the World Bank has deployed over $157 billion to fight the impact of the pandemic. This is, as I understand it, the largest ever crisis response. I just want our audience here to get a sense of what financing instruments you've used and what have been the results. What's the learning here?
This is a mix around the world of loans and grants, and it goes to health, it goes to education, it goes to governments when they're making positive changes in their laws that make them more attractive for business, for setting up vaccine operations. Part of that 157 billion is the supply of vaccines. So IFC, our private sector arm, invests debt and equity in vaccine manufacturing in Africa, and we're helping expand the Aspen Pharmaceutical in South Africa, and we're helping research other sites where vaccine manufacturing can occur. So there's a range of investments made in development from that $157 billion. And remember, it's leveraged from donors. So donors put money in, and we borrow heavily against it in capital markets. So it brings in people from around the world together in sustainable development efforts. Climate is a core one that's expanding rapidly as well.
No, I understand that. Ngozi, I just want to come to you at this point. The WTO was created, of course, in 1995, in part to address how trade could be used to promote sustainable development. I just wonder, I mean, this is a question that I've been asked myself over the last 19 months, whether the WTO has actually failed low-income countries in this instance. And I just wonder what your response to that is.
I would say my response, Becky, is no. The WTO has not failed low-income countries in this instance. This is actually an opportunity, a time when the WTO and trade has responded very well. People do not know it, but last year, as the value of trade fell by more than 7%, the value of medical supplies and products being traded rose by 16%. And personal protective equipment by 50%. What does this mean? That the WTO's, the trade backed by WTO's rules was actually moving goods around to where they were needed. Secondly, you mentioned the issue of the TRIPS. Earlier on, you talked about the TRIPS waiver and the IP. Of course, it's a WTO agreement. More than 100 countries members are asking for a waiver of the intellectual property rights so that they can have access to this to manufacture vaccines. We have other members who think that this will, if you do this, it will get in the way of innovation. So what are we trying to do? Actually, there's an emerging consensus from all members now, after a lot of debate and discussion, that we need a solution to the IP problem, that people are dying, it's unconscionable, we should not solve this. So as I speak to you, there are discussions going on for a pragmatic solution, and I think we will get it, Becky, that will allow developing countries access to know-how, technology transfer, and then at the same time, in a way that will assure those who have developed these vaccines that they will be protected. We are not going to disincentivize research and innovation.
Ngozi, with respect, there will be people who will be quite cynical about what that solution might look like. So can you just explain what you think it might look like?
Becky, this is something being discussed at the moment by members. So I cannot say what the ultimate solution will be. But I want to say that I'm pretty sure it will allow better access than we have now from some provisions in our TRIPS agreement and make it easier for countries to get access. We have to find a way of bridging this gap. And really, we all agree it is not right that people should be dying. We need to make sure that technology is transferred, that developing countries can manufacture. I can't put on the table now because they're negotiating it at this moment. So I can't tell you the ultimate answer, but I know it will come out to a pragmatic place.
Well, that's good to hear. And I hope you will join us on... Go on, Tedros. Yeah.
Yeah?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So on IP, I think the IP waiver would be very important. And as global community, we should ask ourselves, why do we have even the IP waiver as a legal instrument if we're not going to use it in such unprecedented condition? Situation. This pandemic happened more than 100 years after the 1918 flu. And the provision in the TRIPS agreement was made in order to use it in such situations, in emergencies. So how can we say this should be an issue for debate? When are we going to use, the provision? If we cannot use it now? I mean, my response is we should use IP waiver now. We should waive it because these are unprecedented times. And then the other thing I would like to raise here is we have spoken to some countries who are not supporting IP waiver and spoken to manufacturers. Their response is, even if we waive IP, it will not be useful unless it's accompanied by technology transfer. Our response was, okay, if what you're saying is the problem, then why not you just waive and let's try it if, it works or not? Because without trying, you wouldn't know. But when you talk about technology transfer, once you open or waive IP, it can trigger technology transfer because those people who are working for those who control the IP will be free, since it will be legalized, will be free to migrate and help others. Or they can work part-time to transfer technology. So it can happen if the IP is waived. And the other is, as Ngozi said, I fully agree, we need incentives for the private sector. We need to appreciate their role because they have developed these vaccines in less than a year. So in order not to affect the incentives for the long term, the waiver could be for a very limited period of time. It could be 2 years or 3 years or until the end of the pandemic. And it could focus on vaccines only. But, not waiving it now,
I understand,
when the situation is unprecedented and the emergency is clear and the whole world is the hostage of this virus, if we cannot waive it now, then when? To be honest, this is really something where I can say humanity is failing miserably. And this is not acceptable. It's in the interest of the manufacturers. It's in the interest of each and every country in the world to waive IP, do everything to increase production and end this pandemic as soon as possible and open up the world and release.
Well, you heard that from the from the head of the WHO.
Could I just add to that, just quickly, one word? We've been talking about waiving this IP, and I think that has brought people to the table. I think let us, in a short while, hopefully, maybe by our 12th ministerial, which starts at the end of November, both sides are talking to each other, and they should come up with a solution that will give us light on this problem.
Well, let's hope that happens, Ngozi.
One word.
Go on, Kristalina.
If I may, just to say that Tedros touched on something very important. It is the waiver, but then it is the technology, and it is the skills and the capacity to build that self-reliance. And they have to all go hand in hand. I'm actually encouraged to listen to some of the scientists and some of the manufacturers that are recognizing this is a terrible pandemic, may not be the last one. And if the world is to build strength, capacity to face health risks in the future, now is the time to approach this in a comprehensive manner. We need resilience. We need resilience for shocks to come.
And I do want to talk about that preparedness with all of you as we close out this extremely interesting session tonight. Before I do that, it will come as no surprise to any of you that we are not only dealing with the pandemic, but also an infodemic and a low level of trust in big societal institutions, such as the ones that you are leading. Kristalina, I'm going to start with you because just last night, the IMF board affirmed its full confidence in your leadership after investigating your conduct while at the World Bank related to data regarding China's economic performance. I want to give you an opportunity to respond to that decision and ask you whether you think this episode has further eroded trust in institutions such as the IMF and entangled you personally in the wider geopolitical rivalry between the US and China.
Becky, I'm so glad you asked. The board of the IMF, in a comprehensive and impartial process, reviewed the evidence, and it concluded that it has full confidence in my leadership at the IMF. So I can rally the fabulous staff of the IMF, work with our partners, those who are on this panel, to address the tough challenges we face. We talk about the pandemic, we have climate, we have the issue of inequality. And of course, I take it to heart that we have to strive always to demonstrate that what we do touches positively the lives of people. And I take pride of what we have done at the IMF in these 2 years to mobilize incredibly strongly to help our members. And I'm confident that you would see the IMF to be that beacon of integrity of our data and research, as we have always been. You're right, we have to always work for the public trust. And that's what I have been doing for 40 years.
And you've been asking for accountability and transparency tonight on this very panel. David, I have to come to you. The credibility of international organizations has been eroded due to various controversies, not least that of the IMF or the World Bank and the issue that we've just been discussing with Chris Salina. Does this trust need to be rebuilt, sir?
I'm looking forward to strong collaboration continued with IMF, with Kristalina, with Ngozi and Tedros. And one thing I would say is, you have with you today four really hardworking public officials that are watched every hour, every day, every week. So we're working hard in order to get the job done. I know my day is full of chances to try to make a difference and to help people. And I look forward to having as much integrity, accountability in all of those affairs as we can. World Bank's doing quality research into the future, and it's vital as part of the development effort.
What are the learnings out of this episode, David?
Learning is constantly review the quality of your products, make them better, build them hard, and keep focused on getting good development outcomes for countries.
How do we prepare for future potential crises? Ngozi?
And I was going to say preparedness is a core part of World Bank and of IDA. We fast-tracked front-loaded our IDA into the crisis, and that's been vital in delivering as many programs as we have.
Ngozi.
Yeah, Becky, thank you. Actually, to prepare for the next crisis, I have to tell you, the G20 finance ministers set up a task force to look into this. And this was co-chaired by myself, by Larry Summers and Tharman Shanmugaratnam, the senior minister of Singapore. And we found 4 major gaps in pandemic preparedness. We found that there's a gap in globally networked surveillance and research to prevent and detect emerging infectious diseases. We found a second gap in resilient national systems. That means that our health systems, when this happened, were just not prepared, both in rich and poor countries. We found that there was not an adequate supply of medical tools and countermeasures to deal with this pandemic. And as we've just been talking, also inequity of access. The world was not prepared for access to this. And the last gap was in global governance. There just wasn't the mechanism to coordinate all the different organizations to make sure that funding came on time and that the international financial architecture worked. And there was no organization to really be accountable for all the outcomes. We made 3 recommendations to be prepared, and I'll be very fast. One is that we all have to increase spending domestically to strengthen our health systems. In low-income countries and middle-income countries, we've actually suggested 1 percentage point of GDP extra in spending over the next 5 years in order to be prepared. In addition to this, we are also saying we need increased international spending, because there's a public good aspect to managing the pandemic. We've recommended $75 billion over the next 5 years, 15 billion a year, of which 10 billion should go into a global health threats fund. And finally, we've recommended improved global governance, a global health threats fund, a global health threats board that would oversee and coordinate our preparedness for the next pandemic and the spending.
Tedros, I do want to get your perspective. I've also got a question from an interested audience member watching this discussion who says the WHO is at the forefront of global health. And Renee asks, will COVID lead to the reform of management and investment in medical and health research?
The answer is yes, it will. As I said earlier, this pandemic is unprecedented, and we're documenting all lessons that we need to learn. Part of it, which Ngozi said, and all these recommendations should be implemented. I think this will help us if we can, learn from this pandemic properly and implement the recommendations. The world will be different, and we can be better prepared. One thing I would like to add to this is the pandemic treaty will be very important, or pandemic agreement. We have seen many challenges that could have been addressed if we had a framework or a legal instrument that could guide us. So that would be very key, by the way, in the change we will have to prepare the world in a better way, the pandemic treaty or pandemic agreement.
Kristalina, finally, I just want to come to you. You came to the IMF wanting to talk about gender pay parity, doing more to tackle the climate crisis, talking more about income equality. You couldn't have known quite what was coming down the pipe with regard the COVID pandemic. You've gone beyond this narrow focus and adopted a much more, as some would describe it, holistic approach. Which is exactly what many of us said that we needed. I wonder whether, to a certain extent, you feel as if that may be what got you into hot water recently, but also just get your perspective on ultimately what the learnings are here to ensure that we are more prepared for any eventualities going forward.
We are living in a fast-changing world, Becky, and we have to anticipate what next, and then have the agility to prevent crisis, to respond quickly, to target the most vulnerable. And to do so, as Ngozi was saying, across the board, we need to scan the horizon better. We have to have better monitoring of these risks. And then the extra capacity, if necessary, to step up. But above all, we need to work on countries to have strong institutions, educated people that are healthy, capable to adjust to these shocks, to care about the agility and capacity of our planet to absorb these shocks, and to be with institutions everywhere that have the skills to lead towards a more sustainable, more equitable future. What does it mean? If you compare with the pandemic, who did the pandemic hit the hardest? People with weak immune systems. The same way countries with weak institutions, with weak immune systems get hit hardest. So working relentlessly to build that institutional capacity, to have development that gives jobs to people, makes them able to have good business opportunities. This is what matters. To turn it into the language of our conversation today, building resilience is about people, institutions, and our planet.
Having you all with us today has been extremely important. I know that the audience listening to this will have found this incredibly valuable. David, you're right. All of you are extremely hard workers. It is so important that the conversation is out there, that the challenges that you face are clear, and that the goals that you have set yourself with this multi-leader task force are clear and we hope achievable. We thank you very much indeed, all of you, for joining us today. It's been fascinating, and let's hope that we are not talking in 19 months' time about the very same issue of vaccine inequality, because that would be terrible. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today, all of you. I'm Becky Anderson. Good night.
And welcome. We are live from World Bank Group headquarters in Washington, D.C. I'm Juliette Powell, and I'll be your host today as we continue our discussion on how to end this pandemic and build a truly inclusive recovery. We've just heard from the leaders of the task force, and over the next half hour, we'll be digging deeper into some of the issues and asking what can be done to accelerate access to vaccines for developing countries, and how are the private sector and civil society helping to address this challenge? We'll be joined by leaders and experts from across the globe. Here's a quick look ahead. Every single one of us has been affected by this pandemic, and getting through it is a shared global priority and our responsibility. We're hearing from people affected in different ways, from youth, civil society organizations, as well as global leaders. So let's start in the Philippines. Like in most places, the pandemic shut down schools, markets, transportation, leaving people desperate for an end to the threat of COVID-19. We asked one mother and daughter to share their experiences and their hopes now that vaccines have begun to reach those most in need.
Yung sa TV po kasi, yung sa balita, sa news, sa internet, na madami nga daw pong namamatay dahil sa sakit na to. Tas doon po kami natakot.
Siyempre po, natakot po ako. Mahawa yung mga anak ko, tsaka mga apo ko, lalong-lalo na po kami, may edad na rin.
Nag-announce po yung school namin na online na lang daw po yung enrollment. Hindi po ganun kalakas yung internet connection, then sumasabog po yung website nila, kaya hindi po makapag-enroll ng maayos. Ang dami pong hadlang, hindi na din po ako nakapagtrabaho noon kasi wala pong sasakyan. Hindi po ako makapag-commute, walang transportation. Yun, si mama at papa po, nag-stop din po sila ng trabaho.
Ang trabaho ko po ay nag-aalaga po ako ng bata. Dati po nung wala pang pandemic. Pero po ngayon, wala na kasi wala na rin pong pasok yung bus ko. Mahirap po kung saan kami kukuha ng kakainin.
nagpa-vaccine si mama ngayon. First dose niya, nag-aalinlangan po siya sa una pero kinausap naman po namin siya ni ate na normal lang naman po yung side effect.
Kina po, masaya kasi tulad yan, pumapasok na rin po yung mga anak ko, tapos ako rin po nabaksinan. At yung asawa ko may pasok na rin po. Hindi na po kami masyadong hirap.
Yung pangarap po talaga is makapagtapos ng pag-aaral. Tuloy-tuloy po yun, walang stop. Then, maging HR manager po. Yun talaga yung gusto kong mangyari. Masaya po na dumating siya dito sa Pilipinas. May mga una na pong nabakunahan. Nagsunod-sunod na po. Ang nais ko lang po sabihin na sana mapabilis na po yung pagbabakuna para matapos na po ang pahirap na pandemyang to. At matuloy na po natin ang mga pangarap na gusto nating makamit.
Salam, I'm Zarina Nurmukhambetova from Almaty, and you're watching the World Bank Group IMF annual meetings.
What an incredible story of survival and hope. We're streaming this event in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic on World Bank Live and on our social media channels. And to tell us how you can finally get involved, I'm joined now by Shri Sridhar. Welcome, Shri.
Thanks, Julia.
So we had a chance to listen to the task force leaders talking about all of those challenges. How about getting the people that are watching involved as well?
Absolutely. So similar to yesterday, you can follow us on our social media channels. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also share your comments at any time using the hashtag for today's event, which is Vaccines for All. And you can also post your questions and comments at any time on live.worldbank.org. So really a lot of ways for everyone to kind of get involved and join the conversation. Now, you did mention that the event is being streamed in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic. And the good news is we've got experts standing by in all 4 languages, and they're working hard to answer as many questions as possible. We can see some of them right here. And I know that some of the most popular questions, I think, are going to be put to a couple of the senior experts later today.
Yeah, we're very, very lucky. We're going to be joined a little bit later on by Mamta Murty. He's the bank's Vice President of Human Development. We've also got Stephanie van Friedeberg. You might even know her. She's a Senior Vice President of Operations for IFC. And we've got our viewers. Now, how do we get them involved in the poll?
Yes, so the poll for today asks what is most important to ensure equitable and successful COVID-19 vaccine deployment? And there are 4 options. The first, is it by having an adequate stock of vaccines, a sufficiently funded, resilient, and inclusive health system, enough equipment, and trained public health personnel? Or is it by having engagement of local community leaders and organizations? So once again, the poll for today asks what is most important to ensure equitable and successful COVID-19 vaccine deployment? And the choices are: is it by having an adequate stock of vaccines, a sufficiently funded, resilient, and inclusive health system, enough equipment and trained public health personnel, or is it engagement of local community leaders and organizations? So for those of you, folks who are tuning in, head on over to live.worldbank.org and cast your vote before the poll closes.
Thanks so much, Shri. I really look forward to hearing what the results are going to be. We're going to find out by the end of the show today. Thanks.
Thanks, Juliet.
Now, the private sector is playing a very important role in pandemic response, vaccine production, and distribution. To learn more about what the private sector can and is doing to meet vaccine needs and the challenges faced, IFC Manager and Director Maktar Diop is joined in discussion by 2 leaders in the health field.
I'm joined by 2 great leaders who are in the area, each making a huge difference. Stride Massivia is a founder of Econet, a leader company in the digital sector in Africa. But also he has been working a lot on vaccine, and he's a special envoy from the African Union to help really bring the private sector in producing more vaccine in Africa. Narendra is the CEO of BioE, where, as you know, a lot of the production of vaccine has been coming from India, and the research also in this area has been going on. We have today a situation where only 4% of the population in Africa is vaccinated. We have a lot of vaccine inequity that have been discussed and talked about. And today, we would like to discuss what we can do to solve that issue, and these 2 leaders will give us
the insight and the idea about how we can go about it. Let me start with first with Strive. Strive, you've been involved very much in making sure that we increase the supply of vaccine in Africa. So what needs to be done to increase the supply of vaccine in Africa?
Thank you very much, Makta. It's good to see you, my dear brother. My job as the African Union Special Envoy is to coordinate the acquisition of vaccines. I coordinate a task force made up of ministers and health specialists, including the Africa Center for Disease Control, to purchase vaccines. We have created a special purpose vehicle called the Africa Vaccine Acquisition Trust, which we funded with a $2 billion facility. We also have secured, as you know, over $4 billion of support from the World Bank for the member states to buy vaccines. This is the first time anything of this scale has ever been done, where Africa is buying together vaccines on a major scale. So I've got although I don't come from the sector, I've picked up some idea of what the challenges are, and I hope we'll be able to discuss them as we proceed. But really, that is my job, and it's been the challenge for us has been to secure supply, because Africa made the mistake of ceding manufacturing of vaccines to other regions of the world. And this is the thing that we have to fix, that vaccines must be manufactured on the African soil.
Thank you very much, Strive. I'll come back to you and ask you, what are the conditions for it to happen? And with your huge experience in the private sector in Africa, what needs to be done to attract private sector to invest in vaccine? I'll come back to you to that after asking Narendra, who is from India, why has they been able to do that? So how have you been able to do that in India? And what are the three lessons that you can draw from your experience that can be useful for the part of the world who want to do the same thing?
I think India is a different story. I think it's a long story. And quickly, the Indian private sector manufacturing started in the 60s with the Serum Institute and our company in a small way. But the real fillip for the Indian vaccine manufacturing didn't happen until Gavi was formed in the late 90s and 2000s, where there were incentives created by the Gates Foundation and WHO to pre-qualify companies out of India, and they started supplying the global market that included Africa and other nations. I think that gave the fillip of large capacities in India that we're able to utilize now. On top of that, India also had large biologics and biosimilar market, and these facilities have been repurposed. So I think it's not a one simple story. It is a combination of an evolution of a domestic market, incentivized by global markets, UNICEF and Gavi, and complemented with the pharmaceutical markets that allowed India to be able to respond to the pandemic in its own way. In terms of lessons, I think that this lesson's probably not the right way to go because it takes a long time to get there. And I'm sure Strive will talk about it. But continents like Africa do have the ability to create a market of its own, and by centralized procurement to incentivize manufacturers to come into Africa. I think the challenge of the pandemic is slightly different because if you look at how the pandemic has been addressed, not only in India, but in US and Europe, they had to leverage pharmaceutical facilities to be able to scale up. So the creating a pandemic-ready infrastructure will be a different challenge that we have to figure out how to address. So I think the three lessons would be domestic market for Africa, for African manufacturers, incentivizing either with the push and pull funding to make the prices affordable, and to create pandemic manufacturing infrastructure and funding it on a regular basis, not knowing when the next pandemic will hit, would be the lessons. They're not directly from India. India was able to do it inorganically, but that's what I believe needs to be done in other areas.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to my friend Strive. Strive, you've been one as a precursor in an area where it was quite complicated at the beginning, digital. Not a lot of people wanted to put their money in Africa, take that risk, and be able to price the risk, understanding, and to be able to address the challenges that investors were facing at that time. Built on your experience in the digital, what you think, from what you heard from Narendra, from your own experience, will be the conditions to attract more private investment in vaccine in Africa?
Well, I think it's very important what my colleague just said. It's very profound because I came to the same conclusion that it was institutions like Gavi that are responsible for the crisis in Africa. Because what they did was to create a public market in the purchase of vaccines, and then to strategically shift it to India. So there is no way that African industrialists could respond, because the buyer decided that Africa's vaccines would come from India. This was a strategic decision in which Africans had no say. And so we find ourselves in this situation whereby when we got into a crisis, and India was in the same crisis, India said it would take care of its own people, and we went to the back of the queue. Africans are really mad about this. Okay, and I have told Gavi and UNICEF and even Gates that this was wrong. We need to correct this. I'm sorry, but we've got to be blunt about it. African industrialists can do exactly what Indian industrialists can do. Okay, we have companies in Africa who were denied the opportunities that were extended to Indian manufacturers, and that's why we're in this mess. And we have to correct it. We admire what has happened in India, but we have to do the same, because we exported to India millions of jobs in the production of vaccines. Okay, and I have said this and I will say it again. We have to fix it. Our industrialists are capable of producing vaccines. This is not a complicated thing. It's the same technology that they have access to. We know from Aspen and BioVac and Dakar Institute that had the same support been given to them by the likes of Gavi and UNICEF, we would not be in this mess. So so I will say it and say it again.
So I thank you very much, but I think that there is an opportunity for convergence here. Narendra, I know that you are looking also at working in other places outside from India. And I think maybe this is an opportunity to invest in Africa, because there is needs, there is a market, as you said, and there is a willingness to build that ecosystem in some of the countries. Would you be interested if industrialists from Africa, as Strive said, were approaching you and say, let's do a joint venture and invest in the continent?
Absolutely. I think for us, as I said, I think that I completely agree with Strive on the outcome of what Gavi did with respect to the pandemic. Now, whether Gavi could have foresaw this kind of a pandemic, I mean, that's debatable. I think the world has never seen a pandemic like this, where essentially everybody had to get vaccinated. So having said that, to answer your question, I think we definitely look at Africa. I think for us, it is a market of importance. We have been servicing through Gavi, but if it necessitates that, and not necessitates, I think it is, the pandemic has taught us that, while we appreciate India, looking out for India. As a private company, we don't feel good when people that have supported us globally, that is PAHO, Africa, we're not able to service. So it's not a good feeling when we're not able to give back to countries that have supported us for a long time. But unfortunately, it's not in our hand. But to answer your question, yes, I think that we would be very open as a company to do it ourselves. Our preference is to find partners that we can do it with, and then we'd be very open to do it. In fact, actually, we are slowly initiating discussions around it.
I think that this conversation was aiming at creating this link. And I think that we are building it together, the three of us. So, Strive, to you, please.
Well, when I met with you, recall, I said, the future for you is to manufacture from Africa. You can own 100%. I will personally buy, you name the African country, I'll buy the land and give it to you for free, myself, with my own money, okay, as a gift. You must manufacture from Africa. And the future is that's what's going to happen. When Sinopharm came to me, I said, you manufacture from Africa, otherwise you don't get orders. They are now manufacturing in Africa. I'll give them an order. If you want orders from us as Avat, you come and manufacture from Africa. You choose your country, you do what you want, you can have it 100%, whatever you want, but you do it from Africa. And we are going to start putting a lot of pressure on Gavi. Every single contract that Gavi now signs, if it is to supply Africa, they must justify why that production did not come from Africa. Okay? This is the result of the decision that was taken in India to just cut us off. You cut us off in March politically. You said, no more vaccines. We'll deliver to you when we have delivered to our own people, which is what Europe did to us. Okay? So I've said it to the Indian manufacturers, you are welcome. You, Serum Institute, BioE, come. But you make from Africa. So we can also have jobs. And next time, no one can cut us off politically.
Thank you so very much, my friend. This is a wonderful conversation, but unfortunately, as I say in my country, all good things have an end. And we have to, but I think that we made a lot of progress, Strive and Narendra. Thank you very much. Often we say, as these discussions, this meeting leading to something. Today I have the feeling that it leads to something very concrete and precise. Strive, you made a call for investment in vaccine in Africa. Narendra said, yes, I'm looking at it. I'm interested in doing that. So I think that IFC, who is working with both of you, would be very happy to be your partner in doing that together and creating those opportunities. So this is for us a great outcome of the conversation, and we continue. And let me say a last word. This is just the beginning for us of investing in the health sector in Africa. We have a lot of other health challenges to deal with. Diabetes is becoming an increasing problem in Africa. High blood pressure, all these drugs which are so necessary to improve the health of African population needs to be built cheaply, make it accessible to the people of Africa. And I think that this conversation that we started, for me, is the beginning of a bright future. And I would like to thank you all of you for joining me. Yes, please try.
Let me just say one quick thing. I'm not in the vaccine industry. I'm a tech guy, okay? I will help you find partners if you want. You can be 100%. You are welcome. Come and produce in Africa.
Beautiful word to conclude, Strive. Thank you so much, all of you, and be safe. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Redon from Dhaka, and you're watching the World Bank Group IMF annual meetings.
If you're just joining us, I'm Juliette Powell, and you're watching Ending the Pandemic, The Road to an Inclusive Recovery. It's been incredible listening to Maktar and his guests discuss the vaccine challenge in Africa. Now, we all know that the situation varies across the continent, but on average, less than 5% of the African population is vaccinated. And that's why the World Bank has intensified its technical and financial support in the region. So let's take a look at how that's actually making a difference to the health systems, and particularly for the people in Côte d'Ivoire.
Au début de la pandémie, ça a été très difficile pour nous-mêmes en tant que personnels de santé et dans nos relations avec nos parents, nos amis, les clients et le personnel. Compte tenu du fait que la maladie, elle est très contagieuse.
Je pense que comme tous les gens, on a senti en 2020 qu'il y avait un ralentissement dans toutes les activités. Et j'ai dû rester même un moment avec mes enfants pour leur donner des cours à la maison. Donc après cela, ce sont les témoignages et puis ce sont les informations qu'on a par-ci, par-là et au travers des médias. Donc constatant la gravité de la situation, je me suis décidé d'aller me faire vacciner.
Et plus la population sera vaccinée, mieux on va freiner la circulation du virus. Et les gens vont reprendre une activité normale. Parce que vous êtes convenu avec moi que depuis cette maladie, il y a beaucoup de choses qu'on ne peut plus faire. Il faut revenir à une vie normale. Et pour revenir à une vie normale, seule la vaccination peut nous aider à revenir à une vie normale.
Combating the pandemic through the successful rollout of vaccination programs requires collaboration across all levels. The African Vaccine Acquisition Trust is a joint initiative between the African Union, the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the World Bank and other African institutions, and the whole idea is to fast-track vaccine acquisition on the continent. It's being heralded as an extraordinary regional effort, and I recently had the opportunity to speak to Dr. Ahmed Agwel. He's Deputy Director of the Africa CDC about the importance of regional collaboration and all of the challenges faced.
I'm joined now by Dr. Agwel. Let me begin by asking you this. Why is such regional collaboration so crucial in the fight of COVID-19, but also to ensure better preparedness for future health emergencies?
Thank you for having me. Collaboration within a region is very, very crucial. And this is because these countries and communities are neighbors. They share the same similar circumstances, they share similar cultures and understanding. Very often, they also share very similar capacities, whether it is technical knowledge or financial. Now, leveraging on the expertise that is found within a region is much easier than waiting for expertise to come from far away. And whether it is expertise in terms of knowledge or whether it is equipment and infrastructure in terms of laboratory and similar tools, doing that within a region is so much easier. And most of the regions today are already geopolitically organized into regional economic blocks or regional political blocks. And so working within a region like that makes it much easier to gain consensus and then be able to effect some action, especially when it is required quickly. Now, when you look at how do we prepare for future possible health emergencies, you find that a regional response is better because you can quickly be able to share data. you can quickly be able to share experts, you can quickly be able to share resources so that you respond in a very communal manner in a group of countries, and the effect is much faster in that way, and therefore any health risk can be able to be quickly brought under control.
The pandemic has highlighted the risk of major disease outbreaks and highlighted many countries' lack of preparedness to fight them. We've all seen the devastating human and economic fallout and toll that this has taken. But the Africa CDC is focusing on disease surveillance, control, and prevention, as well as emergency preparedness. Can you please tell us, what are the biggest challenges in this work for you professionally and personally?
Let me list a few. One at the top of my list is supply chain. One big challenge has been, how do we get the health products that we need in preparedness and response onto the continent and to ground zero, as it were, where the health products are really required, whether it is as basic as masks or it is as complex as vaccines. How do we secure that supply chain? Africa is not manufacturing enough of its own health products, and this has been a huge challenge, something that we must address going into the future. Second is insufficient regulatory capacity. When you are bringing in health products of any type, whether it's medicines, vaccines, diagnostics, you want a regulatory system that works and works quickly. Now, Africa's regulatory system is not as strong, and this is something that we need to build very quickly. Third is workforce. Where are those experts? How many do you have? How can you distribute them across the continent? This has been a big challenge because we don't have enough. As widespread as nurses are, they're not enough on the continent. As few as epidemiologists, the disease intelligence officers are, there are very few on the continent, and everything in between. So workforce is very, very critical challenge that we are facing. Fourth are institutions. Do you have institutions at country level that can be able to guide preparedness and response? Do you have institutions at the continental level that can be able to do that? Well, luckily at the continental level, Africa CDC is there, and we've been doing a lot of this coordination, but at country level, there are still gaps. So I would say that these are the four main challenges that we see in as far as preparedness and response is concerned. An overarching challenge is the public. How do you get the correct information to them, and how do they respond to that correct information in the middle of an avalanche of fake news and half-truths that are being peddled in social media? So this is a very overarching challenge, irrespective of what kind of outbreak or health emergency we may be responding to.
Just prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, the World Bank funded the Africa CDC Regional Investment Financing Project. The idea was to strengthen disease surveillance, prevention, and emergency response systems across the African continent. How has that kind of support from the World Bank and other institutions helped the Africa CDC to grow over the past years? And more to the point, what's next?
The World Bank has been a very good partner. They came through for Africa CDC at the beginning of the establishment of the agency, and supported us in three big ways. One was to strengthen Africa CDC internally, our capacity, staffing. This has been supported very effectively. Second is to strengthen our ability to build our regional surveillance and laboratory networks. We call that RISLNet. And this is where we bring together all the resources in a region so that they are working for a region and not only for a country. And this, that particular grant and others has continued to help our work. And third is to build the capability of Africa CDC to support our member states on the continent. And this is in many ways to build the capacity of the member states, and as well as to provide much needed infrastructure for preparedness and response. Now, when we look into the future, we are proposing that Africa CDC's new public health order needs to be supported and implemented so that we can effectively be able to prepare and respond to health emergencies on the continent. The new public health order has 4 pillars. One is strengthening institutions for public health emergencies on the continent, both at the continental and national levels. Second is building the capacity of our workforce that we require to respond to health emergencies. Third is local manufacturing of all the products that we need, from those as simple as masks to those that are complex as vaccines. We need to secure the supply chain on the continent. And the fourth pillar is action-oriented and respectful partnerships that are based on the priorities of Africa. If we support implementation of the new public health order, Africa will be better prepared for the next pandemic or the next outbreak.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ogwell. It has been a joy to listen to you today. It has been incredibly inspiring, and we are very thankful for your time. Thank you.
Manaona, I am Dia from Madagascar, and you're watching the World Bank Group IMF annual meetings.
How important to be reminded that strong regional collaboration and the sharing of data, expertise, and resources all together can bring health emergencies under control much more quickly. Equitable access to vaccines is crucial to ending the pandemic everywhere, and we know that access in developing countries remains very limited. We've asked civil society leaders Priscilla Nyaba, Executive Director of Youth Harvest Foundation Ghana, and Nadia Dar, she heads up the Washington, D.C. office of Oxfam International, to share their thoughts, and namely, how limited access is affecting communities and what their organizations are trying to do about it.
We have a mission to support and empower young people to achieve their full potentials in their personal lives, in their professional development, for them to become active advocates of the rights of young people. Since the onset of COVID-19, the Youth Harvest Foundation Ghana collaborated with the Ghana Health Service to create more awareness about the pandemic, using community radios, information vans, and on our social media platforms. We created the Ghana COVID-19 Support Network platform on Facebook. We also made donations of PPEs and other logistics to the Ghana Health Service in the Upper East region to help fight the infection. Some of the unforeseen effects of low to no access to COVID-19 vaccines in Ghana and in the Upper East region where I work is a limited access to reproductive health services and information by women and girls because of fear of being infected.
Low to no access to vaccines is resulting in the world growing even more unequal. Less than 1% of vaccines have gone to low-income countries. 26 people in Africa are dying every hour from COVID as they're told to wait for vaccine charity from wealthy countries. Donations are crucial, but they're neither sustainable nor sufficient. We have to address the monopoly control that a few pharmaceutical corporations have over vaccine price and supply. Oxfam has been working with the People's Vaccine Alliance to secure the temporary waiver of intellectual property rules at the WTO. While many are in favor, we need all governments to urgently agree that the rights to produce these vaccines are shared, to ensure the technology to produce them are transferred via the WHO, and that manufacturers around the world have support to make them. And we need the IFIs to use their extraordinary power to help make this happen.
And that was a very good reminder of the enormous disruptions in healthcare that were caused by the pandemic and the impact that it's had on everyone, even those not directly affected by the disease. Find out more about how the bank is responding to the pandemic and accelerating vaccine delivery at worldbank.org/COVID-19. And I'm joined once again by Shri. I know that you've been following social, so tell us what has stood up for you so far.
Thanks, Juliet. So today's hashtag was Vaccines for All, and we've gotten a lot of comments from folks all over the world, including the United States, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Spain, Ethiopia, India, Ireland, Switzerland, Uganda, and also the United Kingdom. But what have people been talking about online? Quite a few things. They have been talking about the the importance of making vaccines more available to everyone, as well as raising awareness about their safety, about ensuring the technology to produce vaccines is shared, and also the importance of pandemic preparedness and also disease surveillance. Now, we've also been monitoring some comments across social media, so I did want to give a shout out to a couple of comments that have come out on LinkedIn.
Great.
We have a comment here from Alex Mutiso, who says that we now have a cure for malaria, but let's work together to fight not just COVID, but also other social, environmental, and health issues that impact the poor disproportionately. So I think a good reminder about some of the other major health crises still in the world today. And we also have a comment from Atul Save, who says, currently we are facing a shortage of COVID-19 vaccines. Many people are unable to get vaccinated due to inadequate supplies, which is something I think you and I were just talking about a bit earlier, Offset, about that being quite a crisis.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely heartbreaking. And I know that we have the poll. Do we finally have those results?
Yes, we do have the poll results. So today's poll asked, what is most important to ensure equitable and successful COVID-19 vaccine deployment? Now, as a reminder, the four choices were, was it having an adequate stock of vaccines, a sufficiently funded, resilient, and inclusive health system, enough equipment, and trained public health personnel? Or D, was it an engagement of local community leaders and organizations? So before we get to the big reveal, how did you vote?
All right, so if I had my druthers, I would have said E, all of the above.
Okay, that's a good choice. Yeah. I went for A, but shall we see how people voted?
Take a look.
Okay, so with 44.3% of the votes goes to a sufficiently funded, resilient, and inclusive health system, followed by having an adequate stock of vaccines, enough equipment and trained public health personnel, and finally engagement of local community leaders and organizations.
Thank you so much, Shri.
Thanks, Juliet.
Hi, I'm Paul Blake in Khartoum, Sudan, and you're watching the World Bank Group IMF annual meetings.
Hola, I am Jairo Bedoya in Montelíbano, Colombia, and you are watching the World Bank Group IMF annual meeting.
Our audience has been posting questions before and throughout this entire broadcast, and now we are joined live by two World Bank Group experts to respond to some of those questions. We have with us Mamta Murty, who's the World Bank Vice President for Human Development, and Stephanie von Friedeberg, who's the Senior Vice President of Operations at the IFC, which is the private sector arm of the bank. And thank you both for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We're going to start out by the most popular question that came to us from our Francophone audience in particular. And this is coming from Ndege Mami Valérie. She's in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and she sent us a video.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Ndege Mami Valérie de la République démocratique du Congo dans la province de l'Équateur, plus précisément dans la ville de Bandaka. Ma question est la suivante. Comment la Banque mondiale s'est-elle organisée pour que les pays en voie de développement puissent se procurer des vaccins anti-Covid à un prix abordable? Merci.
So I'd love to pose the question to both of you, starting with you, Mamta, and just to recap the question in English. Can you tell us just a little bit more about how you feel the World Bank has organized itself so that developing countries can really obtain affordable COVID vaccines?
So thank you, Juliet, for that question, and also thank you for the question coming in from DRC, a country that I'm hoping to visit in a couple of weeks' time. I would say that the World Bank Group has done four things. First of all, it's made a financing envelope available, a significantly large financing envelope available, so that countries can buy these vaccines and deploy them in country. So as of a week or so ago, already $6 billion had been committed from this envelope to support purchase and deployment in over 60 countries in the world. From that money, countries have already contracted nearly 250 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines, and 100 million of those doses will be delivered this calendar year. So there's a part which relates to just resources for purchase. The second part relates to support for deployment, because as we've heard, it's not enough to get the vaccines to the country. They actually have to go into people's arms. And a lot of the support that we're providing with partners on the ground is to support deployment. You had this video from Côte d'Ivoire earlier, right?
Yes.
Côte d'Ivoire is one of the countries where the World Bank is working, and we've supported the government in ramping up vaccinations. And we've done this by helping community leaders and social influencers talk about vaccines and how they're safe and how they're effective. We're also supporting mobile clinics that can go out to markets, to small villages, tell people about the vaccines and also vaccinate them. The third thing we're doing is we're supporting the manufacture of vaccines and peripherals. And I have my colleague Stephanie here who's going to say a lot more about it. So let me move on to the fourth thing that we're doing. We're doing a lot of advocacy so that developing countries can have their vaccine contracts fulfilled. And you heard from the multilateral leaders task force, from David, Kristalina, Tedros and others, about how important this is, because most of the vaccines have been delivered and are being delivered in the richest countries of the world. And we're saying that manufacturers need to now reprioritize and make sure that the contracts that are in place are satisfied. The developing country contracts that are in place need to be satisfied.
Absolutely. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. Stephanie, would you also like to respond to the question?
Absolutely, Juliet. It's a great question, and it's a good follow-on to the conversation Mamta and I had at the spring meetings. You know, at the start of the pandemic, and you said this, IFC is the private sector arm of the World Bank, we actually thought our job was to ensure that companies stayed afloat and that we maintained jobs in our countries of operation. So we created this $8 billion facility for our existing clients and thought this is our way forward. But then we quickly realized that this wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a health crisis, and we needed to do more. And we could see from our conversations with producers and for people in our countries of operation that most of the equipment and the supplies, to say nothing of vaccines, were all being produced and consumed in the developed world. And we knew we needed to do something different. So we went back to our board and we sought approval for a $6 billion global health platform. And the idea was to help the production of PPE, equipment, pharmaceuticals in our countries of operation. And imagine when we did that, we tacked vaccines on literally the last day before we went to the board as a just in case. So I'm actually really pleased to say that as of today, we've invested $1.9 billion across the globe in companies like Fosun in China, BioE, who we heard from in India earlier today. And our flagship project was a 600 million euro project that we did with a group of DFIs to produce 300 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine on the continent of Africa with a company called Aspen Pharmaceuticals. But we know that that's not enough, and we need to continue to push the envelope. So we have created a new initiative with CEPI to help us. We're partnering with the Institut Pasteur in Dakar, Senegal, to see if we can actually build an mRNA facility for later use. And we're working very closely with the government of Rwanda to create an entire ecosystem to think through how do you actually create pharmaceuticals and vaccines on a more holistic basis. It's a really heavy lift, but it's critical for us as we move forward and come out of the crisis to ensure that when the next pandemic hits, our countries are better prepared.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm glad to hear you talking about shoring up the entire ecosystem. I think that's absolutely fundamental. We've got our second question for you, and this is coming in from Sachin Kumar. He's in India. And Sachin asks, can you predict the next era of COVID or pandemic?
That's a great question. The answer to that is no, one can't predict what the next pandemic will be or even when. But what we can say with certainty is there will be another pandemic, without a doubt. We know, at least in the past 50 years or so, that most of these pandemics have arisen because of the contact between humans and animals. That's why they're called zoonotic. And with urbanization, with intensive agriculture, with what's happening globally, we can expect another pandemic to emerge because of this interaction between humans and animals. So we are saying that countries need to be prepared no matter when this arises, because it will arise. And we really see 4 things as being important for the next pandemic. To fight it, countries need strong health systems. We've learned from this pandemic that if you don't have a strong core primary healthcare system, you're not going to be able to detect or treat or respond to the pandemic. And so as the World Bank, we're placing a lot of emphasis on building strong health systems. The second thing we've learned is that you need regional and global cooperation. I mean, a pandemic does not stop at the border. It doesn't need a passport to go from one part of the world to another. And so we've also supported regional monitoring and surveillance systems. In West and Central Africa, we have a great project which is called Redice, and it's actually supported networked surveillance and monitoring systems to detect and respond to emerging diseases. We've also supported the Africa Center for Disease Control, which has been playing a fantastic role in this pandemic. It's not just regional cooperation. One needs to think of multi-sector responses. Think of this pandemic. One of the ways of responding to it was asking people to stay at home so that it would not spread. But if you ask people to stay at home, how are they going to earn an income? And that's why having some sort of cash benefit or transfer was very important, both for households but also for small businesses. So a multi-sector and a multi-country response is the second thing we've learned is necessary. The third thing we've learned is distributed manufacturing. That's the key to having some kind of global health security, and I think IFC and others play an incredibly important role here. And I think the final thing that we've learned is that you really need to fund these things adequately. We heard Ngozi talk this morning, earlier today, about how countries need to spend much more themselves, right? She talked about a 1% increase in GDP spending to support pandemic preparedness. And she also talked about better network global architecture. So we need all of these things so that we can prepare for the next pandemic, even though we don't know exactly what it's going to be.
I feel like you've, in part, answered our final question today. This was the most popular question that was sent in by the audience that's watching. I mean, they really want to know the answer to this question, which is what kind of transformation is needed for healthcare systems in poor countries? In other words, how do we make the health systems more resilient now and in the future? I mean, how does that work?
I would say they have to be stronger, they have to be better resourced, with trained personnel, with the ability to surge, right? Suppose you have the emergence of a disease, you need more people working on it. You need the ability to detect and prevent disease, and that means you really have to take a One Health approach. You've got to look not just at human disease, but you've got to look at animal disease and how these two are interacting. And then I think you need strong regional and global institutions. I like very much what Kristalina said at the end of the leader segment, where she said what this pandemic has done is it's shown that if you have a weak immune system, you're going to fall sick. It's the same with countries. If you don't have a resilient health system or a means of dealing with an emergency, you're not going to be able to deal with a pandemic. So I think institutional development, starting with strong health systems, is probably what's needed.
Stephanie, did you have a thought really briefly before we go on?
So I actually do. When I look at the conversation we've had, we've been talking a lot about shots in arms, which was a critical imperative for us in the short term. But we need to redouble our efforts to build a more holistic system around the world and at the country level. And that really starts with thinking about things like how do we get modern equipment into places like Africa. So one of the things that we've been working on is a $300 million African medical equipment facility. And what it's designed to do, so we've partnered with GE and Philips and others, and we're giving equipment through leases and through acquisition to small clinics in Africa, using financial institutions as intermediaries. And you know, why are we doing this? So if you look in Africa, who did a recent study that said that only 11% of the countries in Africa have one MRI machine for 1 million people, and 24% for CT scans. You know, if you compare that to Europe, countries in Europe have 89% better statistics on MRI and 97% better statistics on CT scanners. So we know we need to solve the fragmentation in Africa, and working with GE and Philips, we can do that and bring the right technical skills. I think the other thing that Mamta didn't mention, which we've seen very repeatedly, is the need for public-private partnership. So we've learned in our other countries of operation that you can do this through public-private partnerships. We've done really interesting work in Turkey with hospitals, and in Uzbekistan recently with dialysis clinics. The other thing is we really need to double down and focus on education. And I think this is an area where the bank and IFC can really work together. We need health technicians, we need nurses, and we need doctors at scale to really make this work.
Couldn't agree with you more. Thank you both for joining us, and thank you for working together. And to you, our viewers, please do continue to post those questions. We've got experts here that are going to stay online, and they're really going to do their best to answer all of them for you. Now, young people have been deeply impacted by this pandemic. With the closing of schools, you've got separation from friends and from family. They're all struggling to cope, and they worry about being left behind, and with good reason. But they're also incredibly optimistic about their futures. So we asked some young people from around the world to talk about what it was that the vaccine means for them and their communities, and what they can really look forward to doing once they're vaccinated.
COVID has devastated us all due to loss of lives, financial loss, loss of jobs.
A Covid trouxe um impacto negativo, coisas que eu nem esperava, né? Foi uma coisa assim repentina.
Currently, we lack basic sanitation and health services. We are at greatest risk of transmission.
Because many of the resources that were available have been diverted to COVID. It's very, very challenging, and the mental health issues are just tremendous.
I haven't seen a lot of my family and a lot of my friends for so long, and I can't wait for that day when we're all here together.
I believe in science. I believe in immunization through vaccination.
On behalf of young people, the most important thing the vaccine gives us is ensure that we will not be locked down. We will not again feel the weight of his pandemic on our shoulders.
Getting vaccinated means I get to protect myself and my family.
Means we can have these streets full of tourists again, and we can have opportunities for young people like me to grow our business.
Once I get vaccinated against COVID-19, I'll be able to socially interact with my friends without fear of being sick.
Being vaccinated means that my family can be reconnected here in Papua New Guinea on ancestral land.
We will live without the fear of losing our loved ones. There will be jobs and food on the table.
I can attend and hear live mass at church with my family.
Our lives will go back to normal. We can go to markets, we can attend our family meetings, we can go to the communities and work without fear.
We can go back to the streets with the patients, so we can get to transform the hearts of the population in Mexico.
But getting vaccinated would mean we can still take one more step to save our lives.
We want
to get vaccinated
so life
can return
to normal.
And this brings us to the end of this event. I really want to thank our guests for joining us and sharing an incredibly important discussion. And of course, I want to thank you, our viewers. We've still got much more to come for these annual meetings. On Thursday, we're going to be discussing how we can make climate action count. And then, to round off the week, we're going to be focusing on the role of trade in supporting economic growth. Of course, you can watch all of those as well as replay of this event at live.worldbank.org. And of course, we hope that you've all enjoyed hearing from our distinguished guests at today's event, and do continue sharing all of those comments. We'd absolutely love to hear from you. Again, my name is Juliet Powell, and thank you so much for joining us today.